Hey folks, this episode's going to be a bit of a horror binge since it's going to be the first crit hit duo dive. That's right, I'll be tackling two titles I received review keys for, namely Darkstone Digital's The Mortuary Assistant, as well as Woodland Games' Autopsy Simulator. While both of these have some thematic similarities to the point I've even heard them recommended in the same breath, I was more curious to find out how they held up. So, it's time to ask the important question here. Were these titles dead on arrival? Or did they give me more than I asked for? I'm your host, Arlian. Let's find out together. And specifically, let's just start things off with Mortuary Assistant since I am already partially familiar with it due to the whole I binged this demo for 48 hours in the name of a speedrunning contest. Yeah. To wit, our premise. For Rebecca Owens, her internship at the Riverfields Mortuary seemed like an ideal opportunity. If anything, she was eager for the chance to net herself a long-term position. Little did she know. In the dead of night, she finds herself receiving a call from her boss, Mr. Delver, asking her to come in and finish up work. Yet, she finds herself arriving at an empty building and an ominous message hinting that she's in grave danger, that she's possessed and the only way to save herself is to deduce which of the corpses serve as the vessel for the demon haunting her. And unfortunately, as much as she might hope that it's an attempt at hazing her, it's not long before it becomes abundantly clear that there's something direly wrong and that she cannot leave the mortuary. So yeah, it's a pretty straightforward premise all in all, and yet there's more to it than just haunted girl has a bad time. There's a distinct cinematic bent to the experience which starts with the game's slow burn introduction, but which persists even as players progress with the game proper, and yet it's not done in a way that feels intrusive. Rather, it's layered into the gradually escalating scares the player encounters because they aren't simply jolts of arbitrary horror, but personalized segments which serve to flesh out Rebecca by honing in on the traumatic events which have defined her. It goes a long way towards making those expository elements feel more immersive and adds an especially malevolent undertone towards the demon's actions. It also made the act of replaying the game feel fairly rewarding because, well, the haunting sequences aren't fixed, but rather drawn from a potential pool of possible events. And I think in the short term, it definitely helps provide some major shoe drop moments where the context for something will just organically snap into place with a certain degree of viciousness. That said, as fascinating a system as this is, it isn't entirely flawless if you're keen on seeing everything Mortuary Assistant has to offer. Now to clarify, I say this because there's 6 different endings you can obtain, which help to further contextualize the overall narrative. While I found these fairly rewarding, the process of getting these becomes increasingly iterative as you progress, since you will largely follow very similar paths between each playthrough, which begins to dilute the more unnerving elements it has to offer and increase the chances you might stumble into an earlier scene again. As for why the route's iterative, that really boils down to how it plays out mechanically. See, if you look past the whole a demon is poised to wreck you at an existential level deal, Mortuary Assistant's core gameplay can essentially be summed up as a brisk semi-linear point and click which walks you through the process of embalming a trio of corpses. As a foundational element, there's a sort of zen to be found in the process of embalming those bodies, since by design, it's replicable. As you work your way down through the checklist you're provided, the steps in order don't really change. They can't even, to the point that the game will prevent you from preparing things like cleaning solutions in advance if you're of the mind to try and use your time more effectively. In fact, the largest deviation it puts in your path, if you don't count the hauntings, is the manner in which the game rearranges the placement of your embalming tools at the start of every night. But this is less stressful than you'd think, given they're always confined to the relatively petite morgue, which basically just translates to an extra minute or two needed to refamiliarize yourself. And no, I am not counting the process of poking and prodding the corpses in search of wounds as a major deviating point. For one thing, the game is kind enough to let you know how many points of interest you need to find, and for another, it lightly highlights them. So yeah, as far as fundamentals go, these don't really change, even though they comprise a good chunk of what you're doing over the course of your repeated playthroughs. That said, your goal isn't just to process these bodies. You've got some demons to deal with after all, and figuring out how is where the game's deductive elements start to properly kick in. Getting through the evening intact is a bit of a process, but it does add a bit more of a dynamic element to the experience, since you not only need to figure out which demon you're dealing with, but also which corpse they happen to be tethered to so you can incinerate it. Oh, and doing so in a swift fashion because you're on a time limit, which you can only loosely track through the use of, well, a notepad that you scribble on, and the overall intensification of haunting events. But yeah, deduction. So, figuring out your adversary's name is the simplest part of the process, since it mostly hinges on you waiting until the morgue is haunted enough and then snooping around with a talisman until it scorches a fragment of the demon's nom de plume on the wall. Once you have all four, you'll be able to guarantee its name and construct its seal, and also figure out which of Hell's houses it's associated with. Which then leaves the larger problem of figuring out which of the three bodies is actually possessed, and well, that's a fair bit trickier, since initially you'll be reliant on observation. Maybe a particular corpse is more active than most, or perhaps you'll have to revisit older bodies and see if any of them have formed new wounds that weren't there before. Suffice to say, it's this investigatory element that eats up a lot of your time early on, and a part of where refining the process really kicks in because, well, the game provides you the tools to do so. You don't have to treat things as a waiting game if you're disinclined. For instance, you're provided with a website to reference for the various names of the demons. And while you can wait for all four symbols to appear, it's frequently possible to infer which demon you're dealing with from 3 symbols, or even 2 if no others share them. What's more, the game even provides you the tools needed to reveal which demonic house a body would be associated with, which can then be used to confirm whether a potentially possessed body aligns with your demon, or at the very least, changing the odds to a 50-50 gamble for which of the remaining bodies it is, if your initial guess was off. So on the whole, it's an interesting element of the game, since it adds this tension to the act of preparing bodies, trying to discern patterns and small clues that the one you are currently handling might be the demon, or whether something you interpreted as a sign was in fact some form of misdirection, or one of the game's haunting segments that just decided to crop up at that point. It really helps to break things up to a fair degree, and yet, even then, I found myself retracing my own steps. That's not to say there isn't more to do though. If you're intent on seeing the latter half of the game's 6 endings, you will have to actively explore your environment a little bit more, and fiddle with some mild point-and-click elements, and pay attention during the game's myriad haunts. But even with those additional elements, the bulk of what you'll be doing will be the same as the prior playthrough, and if you happen to guess the wrong demon, that's just another playthrough in and of itself as you get your ducks in a row. It can genuinely get a bit wearying at times, and here's the thing though, despite that fact, despite retreading that path and the fact that I should have been completely on the ball, Mortuary Assistant still managed to startle me well into my final playthrough, and that's because it put a lot of work into building up its setting. Let's take the morgue, for instance. Now, on a visual front, it provides a mundane enough environment, and yet I still found it unsettling to navigate, if only because it's built in such a way that it's rife with blind spots, despite being a relatively compact building. You might hear something, but the game generally obliges you to investigate it, because you can't just glance over and see if something's wrong or not, which is then occasionally compounded after the power happens to go out. Which is to say, Mortuary Assistant is extremely aware that what we can't see is oftentimes just as bad as a more overt threat, if not worse. Though it has no shortage of those either. Some of the haunts that occur provide some fairly cinematic transitions between what you were doing and what ensues, landing you into some fairly distinct set pieces, and I'll wholly confess to being unnerved the first few times I reached these. That said, it was the more understated segments that kept screwing with me because, well, once you recognize a transition in what's happening, it loses its power over you. That said, the game's more than happy to mess with you in much subtler ways. Like the moment when I realized something was in the same room as me, watching me, and had been for some time. It was a genuinely uncomfortable moment and left me extremely paranoid for a while. And that's hardly an isolated incident in the game, nor one strictly limited to the visual. There's this perpetual claustrophobic element to the morgue that goes a long way towards explaining why I found myself so uncomfortable at the sound of something in an adjacent room. The knowledge that something had changed, but being unable to see what. On the whole, it's quite good, and God, the sound design is great for the sense of just being stalked. As for the voice acting in the game, there is a fair bit of dialogue despite your relative isolation, and yet what's there does feel altogether solid. As does the game's soundtrack. It's a legitimately unnerving backdrop to the events at hand, and I'll also give it credit for not overusing scare chords in some sort of attempt to tell me when I should feel unnerved. So yeah, this is a whole lot of words to simply say, I think the Mortuary Assistant is a solid example of horror within the medium of gaming. On a fundamental level, it does a great job of building anxiety with its unsettling premise and the unpredictable manner in which it messes with the player. Even after I started to become familiar with some of what it had to offer, I still found myself caught off guard by its more clandestine creeps. Because the game is more than happy to lean away from jump scares and simply focus on being an unnerving experience. I just wish that the fundamental act of playing it was a bit more satisfying. Don't get me wrong, I think there is certainly a degree of novelty to the experience, but the real hook of the gameplay is less what you're doing and more the act of deducing what you're dealing with while trying to manage it being creepy. Essentially, it's more of a horror-themed puzzle game at heart, and this extends to the final 3 of its 6 endings to boot, since they ask the players to engage a bit more actively with exploring the environment, and a few point-and-click segments. And I do mean a few, since it doesn't ask you to veer off the beaten path much, or for all that long, leading you right back to the swing of what you were normally doing. Nonetheless, even with that iterative element, I came away from the experience feeling satisfied. In fact, I wanted more since it answered just enough questions and left enough breadcrumbs that I wound up invested, that I wanted to know more about the setting and where the series might be going. So yeah, on the whole, I do think that the Mortuary Assistant is a hit and a decent example of a legitimately creepy title. With that said then, it's about time that we flip the switch and hop over to Woodland Games' Autopsy Simulator to see how well it measures up. So in Autopsy Simulator, you take the role of one Jack Hanman, a forensic pathologist who spends his evenings recording lessons for students and demonstrating why forced leaves of absences are a thing. The death of his wife has clearly done a lot of damage to him, to the point that he's taking medication like they were Mike and Ike's. In fact, it wasn't long at all until I was left wondering how the guy still has a medical license, given he's actively recording himself having multiple nervous breakdowns. Not to mention the altogether unprofessional and somewhat unhinged manner that he deals with just about everyone he talks to. Then again, it's not like he can help himself, since his problems aren't limited to just a drug problem. It's not long at all, in fact, before signs of a stalker appear, one which might be tied to the traumatic events that led to his wife's demise. So, right off the hop, Autopsy Simulator is a different sort of beast from the Mortuary Assistant insofar as its setting, given that it eschews the supernatural elements in favor of a more grounded attempt at a psychological thriller. And there are moments where it works, where the narrative feels a bit threatening due to understated elements like the sense of being watched, or when it leans towards building tension. That said, more often than not, it sabotages itself as it tries to cram in jump scares and general weirdness, which can basically be summed up as him tripping more balls than a McDonald's play pit. I'm not kidding, it gets to the point where any attempt at cultivating a sense of ambiguity becomes overshadowed by the idea of Jack's cracked, such as choosing to show someone peeking around a corner at you, only for you to round the corner into an empty room versus, oh, I don't know, the idea of someone moving outside your window as you close it, since at least that way if you go outside to go and explore, no one being there is ambiguous. I can't count the times that Autopsy Simulator legitimately plays havoc with any sense of pacing or building suspense. Not that it matters, because the payoff is just, wow. The endings sure are something. Without getting into spoilers, the default one both comes and ends abruptly. While it's technically foreshadowed, the game never really provides you the details needed to question things and parse things out for yourself, so by the time you get there, it just feels very out of place. It's a surprise, sure, but it doesn't really feel earned or all that satisfying, and the secret ending isn't any better, if you can even call it an ending. It's more like a glorified game over. Which, just a small pause here, check out the timestamp if you care about this and skip over. If you're still here, it's overdosing. That's it, it's just overdosing. It's 20 seconds of falling over after you binge those pills. There's no cathartic hallucination or any other sort of denouement. And good luck even unlocking it, by the way, because I sat there chugging pills for literally like 15 minutes, and despite the fact that Jack's guts could have passed for a pharmacy, the man was still going strong. Yeah. Honestly, I think a part of what pains me in all of this is that Autopsy Simulator is a fairly story-focused and linear experience. So all of this is a central highlight of the experience, but to call it a highlight feels inappropriate. In fact, if I had to pin down which narrative element appealed to me the most in this game, it was the case details of the autopsies themselves. I was genuinely invested to know more about each sorted case and to potentially find myself embroiled in them further. The fifth case in particular is a doozy, but no dice. So yeah, that's the story, which means it's time to talk about how fleshed out the mechanics are. And well, at least insofar as a relatively linear walking sim goes, it's serviceable enough, though the lack of a jog button can make backtracking feel a bit tedious. And considering how manic and unhinged Jack acts, it's not like he wouldn't occasionally sprint down a hallway in search of something. I'm just saying, please add a sprint. Otherwise, if you're hoping for puzzles to keep yourself engaged, well, I can think of one offhandedly. Otherwise you just wander around and click highlighted objects to progress, and occasionally bumble into the game's attempt at spooking you. That is, until you get to the autopsies, because yes, not only were these my favorite story beats, they were also the gameplay element I found to be the most engaging. Each of the 5 cases provides a distinct corpse to investigate, and all of them introduce an ever-growing array of tools. If anything, there's a solid foundation for an investigative sim here, cracking open corpses in order to suss out the truth of what killed the various victims. Only, it suffers from the same linearity as the rest of the game. You're walked through the steps of each case one by one, largely in service of the narrative, which means you're never really given the chance to make your own mistakes, or inversely, to feel clever about choosing the correct avenue to investigate. It's always holding your hand step by step, making the experience feel a bit like a prolonged tutorial, albeit one that never provides you the sort of independence you'd want in an investigative title. Seriously, this is a thriller that basically never gives you the chance to snoop for clues, which is just baffling. In fact, it goes so far as to abruptly cut short what was building itself up to be the most morbidly fascinating autopsy. Then again, I really shouldn't be surprised because Autopsy Simulator seems all too keen to shoot itself in the foot in service of a narrative it can't quite land. Because remember that whole thing I said earlier about pacing? It's not just the way the events pan out. Oh no, it also exists on a fundamental level due to how the game's audio plays out.
Okay, making an impression is quite simple. You put trays with alkanate into the mouth and press them together in one. Once the devices have been placed...
Don't get me wrong, I actually don't mind the voice actor who played Jack. Unfortunately, the game does an absolutely atrocious job of pacing out the voice lines. Part of this is the simple fact that his voice lines will overwrite themselves constantly, because lines will play as he moves around, and if you are simply progressing the game at a normal click and moving in an efficient fashion, he will outpace what he was saying prior and continuously cut himself off. And while this is sort of a problem in and of itself, it is absolutely jarring due to how often Jack finds himself unhinging. So he'll go from full-blown hysterical screaming to relaxed to hyperventilating, all within the span of a few moments, maybe punctuated with a yawner 5. It's legitimately frustrating, and it's also really weird just because they intentionally have him talk as much as he does and have these lines triggered the way they are, despite the fact that the pacing feels like something that you would see from Molasses in January. But you know what? Hey, I will give it this. The soundtrack is relatively fine. Though, I'm not sure I can say the same about the sound effects, because the game is more keen on playing its scare chord to an excessive degree in order to cue the presence of something spooky, rather than leaning towards environmental noises to draw your attention. It is incredibly intrusive, and another of those elements that gets goofy as hell by the tail end of it, which, yeah, that's the audio side of things. I am such a loss of words, and this is frustrating me because I was looking forward to this. I mean, comparatively, I have less to say when it comes to a visual front. In general, it's fine, it's competent as far as presentation goes. In fact, I think it did a decent job at highlighting some of the more morbid visual elements that come with a decaying corpse. That said, there are still some rough edges, like intractable points being visible through objects, or things like the security guard Ridley sleeping with his eyes open, or talking about removing your gloves and coat and never doing so you watch yourself going into a cab leaving home with your gloves still on. Yeah, you know, a little weird. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say here is, well, Autopsy Sim had potential. It very much could have provided a legitimately engaging forensic sim with some tasty deductive elements to play with. And yet, whatever mechanical merit Autopsy Sim had was buried in favor of furthering a narrative which never really managed to hook me. It jumps the gun on Jack being clearly an unhinged and erratic mess very early on, and marries that to a personality that becomes increasingly awful over the course of the game. At the end of the day, the game is an excellent example of a mediocre experience, to the point that I'm having a bit of difficulty figuring out who I would recommend it to. Whether it's horror fans or someone looking for a proper sim, something it gets close to doing only for it to just be a handheld sort of tutorial that never reaches completion. And yeah, those who might have held an interest in the investigative elements, Autopsy Simulator finds a way to miss the mark on every single one of these fronts. I could not recommend it to someone who wanted any of these things. And yeah, it's for that reason I ultimately have to call it a fail. It has a lot of potential, and it managed to squander it and just leave me feeling disappointed at the experience. Really, the only thing that I could see redeeming this experience is the finalization of its gameplay-focused autopsy mode, which it's teased at. And that could have the potential to introduce those more engaging deductive elements that I was initially hoping for without the handicap of linearity or the constant intrusion of a less than engaging storyline. But who knows when that'll be or if it'll even pan out that way. Which is why if you're looking for a funerary fantasy to indulge in, the Mortuary Assistant is my poison of choice. Both these games seek to provide a horrifying experience, but of the two, only Mortuary really managed to get under my skin. Its narrative, its gameplay, the way it delivers it is perfectly married to its haunts rather than conflicting with its execution, and it was more than happy to allow things to play out without relying on the horror equivalent of a laugh track. Seriously, even after I started to become familiar enough with things that I'd become more or less inured to the lengthier segments, those subtle moments that crop up still threw me for a loop. And it has so many of those at its disposal. And yes, while its mechanical elements do offer a bit less variety than Autopsy Simulator, its deductive elements are notably solid, and the exploration element did make for a fun bit of puzzle work, ultimately providing you with more to engage with and more autonomy while playing Mortuary Assistant. Oh, also, there's apparently an embalming only mode coming for that game on August 2nd, so I suppose that's neat for the squeamish, but the real highlight of that update is that there's going to be even more haunts and lore being added to the game. So, yeah, it's already good, so you just have more incentive. Go play Mortuary Assistant. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment. If you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description, and check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel, like Shrimp Mania, Green Witch Babby, and Andy Noted have. I seriously adore you folks. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts, and with any luck, we might get an updated design that incorporates a cute little Yimmy on them. So, yeah, that said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.